Welcome to Envizion More. Here, we dig deep into the insights of first-generation wealth builders, unearthing stories of passion, resilience, and relentless vision. Your host is Wayne Wagner Jr., founder of Visionary Wealth Management. So sit back and dig in. It's time to envision more.
Welcome to the Envision More podcast, where we are working with first-generation wealth builders, turning them into first-generation wealth accelerators. Today, we are joined by two dear friends of mine, Trent Booth, my coach and one of my mentors, CEO and president of Veritas Leadership Group. And then the 27-year-old in the room is Dan Keever, and he is our guest host today. And the big question on a podcast about wealth acceleration is going to be, how much do we have to learn from a 27-year-old? But the fact of the matter is that today I actually have the distinct pleasure. This morning I did a podcast with Dan's dad, who was a longtime mentor of mine, Ward Keever. And this afternoon I get to interview Dan Keever, Ward's son. And Dan has been somebody I literally have known since he was an ankle biter, and taught him to fish on the back of his dad's boat. And then I wasn't allowed back on the boat because now the boys wanted to gut fish on the back of dad's boat, and that was not cool. That was not what boats were for.
The catfish were a little messy, admittedly.
Right. But Dan went on to get a full ride scholarship at Regent University, came out and worked for a marketing firm for a short period of time, then set up Advantage Marketing. Then he and his wife started a photography business for high-end weddings. And then they started a video business for high-end weddings and other special events. And then they started Evergreen Marketing, specializing in working with financial advisors and financial planning firms doing their marketing. And so Dan and Madeline are serial entrepreneurs at this stage, and they're second generation entrepreneurs after Dan's in the vein of Dan's dad. And so when we talk about accelerating wealth and accelerating what we put into our kids, along with the wealth that we leave to our kids, Dan is the epitome of that second generation who is being an exceptional steward of the opportunity that he has been given as Ward and Debbie's kid. And then he found a rock star wife, and he and Madeline are just setting the world on fire together, doing amazing things. And Dan does, secret sauce here, Dan does all the marketing for Visionary Wealth Management and works with, we have an on-staff graphic designer, and then Dan works behind the scenes to do all of our marketing and actually producing this podcast. So we wanted to get Dan in here and learn about his journey, really from the perspective of second generation wealth. So with that long wordy intro, welcome Trent and welcome Dan. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Wayne. It's fun. I think the fact that you were talking to my dad earlier today for another episode, we both kind of thought you were going to surprise us and just make us show up on the same episode and talk about it together. So this is fun.
That is a Wayne thing to do, but absolutely. That would have been fun.
Dad was just glad we didn't get to talk it. We didn't start talking about his estate plan and how the money is going to get flowed to the kids and that kind of stuff. So I think he said something like the grandkids are getting it all. So,
well, Liam, my son, would be fully okay with that. He and Nana are dangerous in Costco together, so I could see that happening.
Good stuff. We're going to some big key things we're going to talk about today, Dan, are going to be mentors, milestones, and mindset shifts. Where would you like to start on this journey? Or Trent, do you want to kind of guide us on where we want to start here?
Well, I'll defer to Daniel. What you got for us, brother?
Yeah. So, it's fun to talk about the things that shape you alongside people who have been there for some of those steps. Right. And I think you, with your long friendship with my dad, you have seen, I would say, the in progress moments, not just per se okay, now we're at the end of this talking about like some benchmark. You've seen some of the in progress, you've seen some of the challenges, things like that. But where I think a great place to start, when you are in your 20s, I think the question of what do you want to be when you grow up is way more interesting than like in college or some of these other earlier stages. I was just sitting with a bunch of high school seniors at a mentoring thing, my old high school last week. And they were talking about like, everyone is asking us, what do you want to be when we grow up? And it feels like you have to guess constantly just so you can have an answer at Thanksgiving for grandma, that kind of thing.
Right.
When you are in your 20s, which is a long window, you have a very significant opportunity to decide some of that question just in time to realize that you're now changing the answer again and again and again. And so when we talk about stewarding second generation, not just wealth, but I would even say success or second generation character,
Yeah.
it's a mix of, wow, I now get the path that my parents, my grandparents were trying to guide me in, but I also have to understand it for myself, see where my path is different and where I can shorten a lot of learning curves for myself by listening, heeding advice, heeding instruction, things like that. So that might be an interesting place for us to start is in this window for early 20s, especially if you have someone who's listening to this who has a kid coming out of college or in that early adult stage, trying to wrap our heads around becoming versus arriving. This is a very much a stage where you are learning the direction you want to go, not the stage where you already know what you want to do, what you want to be, how you want to do it, things like that.
Growing up, I told my kids, you have got to learn to work hard, because if you don't know how to work hard, no one of any substance is ever going to take the time to teach you how to work smart. But the fact of the matter is, working smart is something that really comes over time by learning lessons. We can shorten that learning curve by teaching the lessons and having mentors and reading the books and journaling. Trent would be a big one to advocate for journaling and writing down the lessons that we're learning along the time along our path. But ultimately, being able to, so we can accelerate it, but there's still got to be moments where you fall flat on your face. There's still got to be moments of failure. There's still got to be points of indecision. There's still got to be points of, hey, I'm going to take a risk and try something new, and which you and Madeline have done a lot of, something new over the course of the last 5 years. So, by the way, how long have you guys been married?
We are about 5.5. We celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary filming a wedding for Madeline's business. So
Okay.
I would say it was good free food. We'll put it that way.
There you go. Good stuff. So, Dan, that's good feedback here on, kind of shortening the learning curve. You can learn from the mistakes of others. How did you stay connected? I know for a lot of young people, there's even a psychological studies that go on that as young men are becoming men and they're maturing emotionally, psychologically, and they're creating their own identity separate from their father, separate from their family. How did you and your dad kind of maneuver through that season to stay connected and have him continue to be a wise voice and not kind of lose 10 or 15 years there of him, dad's an idiot, he doesn't have a brain, only to come back, at age 30 and say, oh my goodness, dad was so smart, why didn't I listen? So you guys obviously have had a great relationship over time. How'd you do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's two factors that just kind of come to mind off the top of my head. And the first one, and this is just like, I think this is true of people broadly, but especially among men, you respect a track record, right? There's a lot of people that will claim a lot of things. They'll claim insight, they'll claim wisdom, yada, yada. The Bible verse says wisdom is proven by her children. And there's like a little, in my personal adaptation, is parentheses that says not by her appearance. And so for me, in this season of life, we've launched 4 businesses. We have been, per se, off salary since 6 months after being married. There's a lot of decisions we've had to make that place the bet on ourselves. Not in a prideful way, but in a, no, I'm comfortable placing that bet. And the moment you jump into that track, you start to realize that if you don't learn the lessons, it's sink or swim and you're going to sink. And so very quickly you start to realize, I think I need to go to someone I can trust. How do I know who I trust? And one of the great things about having family and mentors who have a track record of character, who have a track record of success, both in terms of what they built and the financial impact of it, is that you don't expect them to be perfect, but they clearly figured things out to a large extent along the way. And the thing that I think put me in the position to have that perspective was that over time, I think what you touched on was like, there were certain pieces of character that were non-negotiables in our household: work ethic, integrity, things like that. But there was never a heavy pressure to be something specific because dad was that way. And the joke is like, he has built a phenomenally successful advisory business from scratch. You guys were both in the same boat together. You know that full well. And neither one of his sons wanted to be financial planners. And it's one of those things like, I'm not a detail-oriented person. I'm more of a strategist, a high-level person. I wouldn't want to be my financial advisor. So it's become incredibly ironic that I found myself in marketing, but for financial advisors, it's all big joke. But it's the kind of thing where he always endorsed my independence, not my disregard of advice, not my lack of need for wisdom, things like that. He always endorsed my autonomy, but was very willing to give measured advice when he felt it was welcome. And so just to that extent, like when you're a son trying to figure out who you are, you're growing up and you're coming into your own vision, your own perspective, having someone you could count on, their life demonstrates their credibility, but they're not overreaching and they're available and they're in relationship. It's even just the things like we worked 80 hours a week for 25 years, but he was the only dad in a suit at the soccer game, every single soccer game. He kept the relationship healthy and active so that when there were moments of guidance, when there was moments of need for wisdom, the relationship was strong. He had my respect, not just because of who he was in his job title, but because of who he was as a man. And so you turn around for me, and I'm in my 20s now. Madeline quit her job as our only salary to go into weddings February of 2020, right before COVID shut absolutely everything down. The first person we asked if that was a good idea or not, and it's pre-COVID, were my parents, being kind of concerned that they'd be like, well, you just started a business, keep the salary, keep the benefits, that kind of stuff. They were the first ones to say, we've always known this was in you. Step out of the boat and start going. We'll back you. And so even like you start a wedding business, drop the salary, drop the benefits, COVID shuts everything down. Right. We doubled down on what we were doing. Well, that's what you would have thought would happen. And if we had jumped out, that would have been true. It was kind of funny. We didn't have any weddings to lose because we didn't book anything. And we had no background really with cameras and stuff at the time. It was all brand new. But because we kept our feet in and didn't jump out, because we had both the counsel and the support of the next generation, we actually got all the reschedules of people who were looking for last minute vendors who lost their date, lost their deposits, things like that. And Madeline, again, no camera background, no formal entrepreneurial background. She started a wedding business at the beginning of the pandemic and is serving $1 million weddings within 3 years. So just to the extent you're like, that doesn't happen if you're not confident in your trajectory. You don't have that confidence if someone who's been there and done that doesn't look at the same picture and say, yeah, I could see that happening. So that's the kind of stuff where like, we are carving our own path, but we are standing on a lot more confidence than if we didn't have that that covering.
Yeah. I hear a couple of things there. One is there's still maybe that time where you're not wanting all the input or not wanting all the advice. Dad's there, but he's not judging your decisions. He's supporting your decisions, probably helping you think through some details. How are you going to carry health insurance? Things like that. Early entrepreneur decisions. So available, not forceful.
And I love a phrase he used. This is probably the pithiest part of this whole podcast for a minute, is the older I get, the smarter my parents get. Yeah. That one phrase, you start getting into life and the real life ramifications of your decisions and your trajectory. And you're like, oh man, I guess they were 27 once. That kind of thing.
Yeah. That one holds up over time, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Dan, would you mind taking us back a little bit? So you're finishing out college, and you're not looking to start a company right out of college, which is interesting. That might shift in the next 20 years, that more and more kids that frankly were generating dollars on TikTok or becoming an entrepreneur straight if they go to college, by the way. But in your case, that wasn't necessarily the plan. You're doing the job for a little bit.
Yeah, it was entrepreneurial thing was always an option, but I think reality hit when it was like February of my senior year, and it dawned on me like that late that Madeline had another semester of college after I graduated. And so through the first 6 months of our marriage, it was going to be a one income family. And I was like, well, I don't know that I have time to build up a book of business. So that was the decision maker. But what was incredible was I joined a company. They were in software and custom websites and had like a little bit of a amazing existential crisis story. The two owners were at a point where leads were starting to dry up. They had been a multi-million-dollar business, bunch of designers and coders on staff. And to accelerate the story, they basically saw one employee doing $20,000 a month in digital marketing. That was like and we also do digital marketing, right? And so they hired me as the intern as my senior year and basically said, hey, if you want to work here, you have a job for you upon graduation. And within the course of that year, they cut out their custom websites by and large, and their software went all in on digital marketing. And we were at, within the first, I think 10 months, is about how long I worked there, about 170,000 a month in recurring revenue. And it was just like, there was me and one other guy just building as fast as we could. And in a funny way, it was a job with a salary, which was fantastic. And they've since blown up. They're building things left and right. For me, it was a brand new sleeve of the business. And so it was on me to learn it, build it. They would hire, I'd train someone else, move on to the next sleeve. And so in a lot of ways, it was way more entrepreneurial than being an entrepreneur would have been, but I had a salary, benefits, and good work friends. Yeah. So it was the kind of thing, like the job wasn't, do I want to be an entrepreneur? It was, where can I access mentorship and resources and examples? And I probably would have still worked there a while longer, but we decided to move to be closer to family. And it was one of those, that they didn't do remote work at that time. They wanted people in office.
Sure.
But it was like, I would have been content to keep working there because I had a trajectory, I had growth, I had these things. But making the jump to switch, I don't think I realized how much opportunity was there despite it being preached a lot. Because I hear the stories like, Wayne, for you starting out, especially when you went independent, but even in the insurance world before that, it was like work 100 hours a week and try and make a profit by the end of it in terms of you were selling. I was allowed to build up freelance clients on the side to supplement my income. And when we decided to move, I called one of them and said, hey, if we lived in Delaware full time, next down the street from you, here's a list of things I could do. Would you be up for that? And that guy called back and said, I'll raise you, make it this list. And it fully replaced my salary and more with one phone call. And that was the moment I was like, maybe I don't look for a job when we move to Delaware. This is the thing.
Okay.
I've heard stories of my dad, like anxious, sick almost every Sunday night going into the work week because how intense and stressful things were. But he keeps telling me, fish jump in the boat. There's more opportunity than people realize. And he might be right about that.
How about it?
Yeah, that's good stuff. So how long did you work for them? And then what was that first business? Was that Advantage Marketing?
Yep. So I worked for them. We got married in June. So let's just say from the full-time mark, about May, June. We moved in February. So it was like, including the internship, maybe 10, 11 months. It was really fast for a really short time. Right. But I started Advantage Marketing in June of that year because they were a small business making a big risky pivot. They couldn't afford what we needed. So I got permission from them to freelance on the side. That was technically the start of Advantage Marketing, supplemented our income. When we built Advantage Marketing, it grew way faster than I thought it would. We were serving about maybe within a year or two, served about 10 different clients in 10 different industries. We had everything from you guys at Visionary to private aviation to mechanical engineering. And we hit two challenges. And this is something has since been a large topic of conversation. It's where Evergreen came from with my dad, is in trying to grow, there was two challenges. One is that I'm not a mechanical engineer. I'm not a private jet customer. I kind of get the financial planning one. But it's hard for me to be an expert in your ideal client when you're in 10 different complex industries. The other thing is, let's just say I even have a decent grip on it. How do you hire an entry-level employee when it took you 2-3 years to learn basic jargon and really be able to operate within industry? And so it's just one of those, we saw that there was a big dead end. And the question was like, is this the right model? Is marketing the right thing? You like marketing, but you don't like the day-to-day work that you're getting stuck in. And then that's where we started having conversations with my dad, started having conversations with Madeline. She's like my number one sounding board, and basically just said, okay, then instead of saying this didn't work, you say, how can you fix it? How can you uncork the clog? And that's where we decided to specialize. And within 12 months, we cut out all of our revenue, minus, I think, 2 clients that weren't in the financial space. But within that 12 months, we had over and above replaced the same amount of revenue, bigger, better clients, people we knew we could specialize in. So it's just those things where you realize that the entrepreneurial decision, there might be one that kicks it off, and it might not even be, I'm going to be a business owner. It might be supplementing your income, right? But just that spirit of freedom that like, I can go get this. And it's going to be risky. There's times it's not going to be fun. And there's times you wear too many hats as you pay your dues getting out of the weeds. Yeah. But how do I get out of the weeds and build something that's bigger than me, starts to scale beyond me? And that's kind of the step we're in right now with growing our support side. But it was definitely not a question of dead end. It was definitely a question of what's the pivot to keep refining our trajectory.
Yeah, there's I can't remember who said it, but there's people who go through life building foundations, and they get stuck building foundations. They never stick around to finish the house. Mm-hmm. But I think that in your 20s, it is important to, like you said, your vision is still evolving. And so what you're going to be when you grow up is continuing to evolve. You continue to figure out what that vision of the future looks like. And I always looked at it from the perspective of, who I wanted to be, what I wanted to become wasn't defined by a dollar amount or a size house or trappings. It was, my vision when I was 27 years old. I was working with my first professional coach and writing a mission statement, which was, by the time I'm 50 years old, I want to carry enormous influence in every room I operate in, not because of the position I wield or the power that I hold, but because of the investments I've made in every sphere in which I operate. And so, so it was the vision is more character driven. It's who I want to be. My wife and I were talking about this a couple of weeks ago. The conversation of we have a couple of people in our sphere where the husbands have been unfaithful, and I said, it's just inconsistent with my vision for my future. That when they put me in the box, I'm going to be the guy who died faithful to that wife. Mm-hmm. And so that's a character design on who I want to be. But while you're in your 20s, you're started 4 businesses, and one of them has dropped off because you've still got 3 at this stage, right?
Yeah, one of them was not a me business. You talk about something that's not you. During COVID, a lot of our friends, they either lost their jobs or the people were like furloughed, things like that. And so we had a number of friends in the teaching space that things were hard, especially for them and their spouses. I had a number of friends who were photographers, and I said, look, if I build a website and like hook up a Calendly, do you guys want to do real estate photography? I'll like throw in some basic social media. And I think I made like maybe $20 a listing, and that was just enough to kind of cover the costs of running the business. But that was it was like one of those, hey, I don't have loads of cash sitting around to help out friends like during hard times. That's also just kind of a weird dynamic. So, but what if we built something together? Just something as small as that. That's still technically going, but I've handed that fully off to the guys who do the photography. But that was the one that dropped off.
Right. That's really neat, though, that you have friends who can carry a camera, can go do a little bit of work, and your vision is how do I teach them to fish? Mm-hmm. So I don't have a lot of fish to give them. I don't have a lot of dollars to give them, but hey, I can go I can do Calendly and send out some emails and see if we can start a business to help these folks fish for themselves.
One of the best parts about that, I know, Wayne, just from your experience, you learned that very much with the school, was there are times where your contribution can change the trajectory of something, but that doesn't mean you're supposed to carry it, right? And
Right.
so, like, even for the photography thing, as you guys know, sometimes client relationships are the time consumer that aren't moving you forward, just in terms of like high needs clients, things like that.
Right.
And so the moment that I realized, I was like, this is starting to tip from like a helpful side project to cutting into my available time and focus to my company. Call to my buddy, hey man, I'm getting ready to step out. Is this worth continuing for you? If so, I'll make a handoff. And just kind of those like real conversations, it started challenging me that I needed to make sure my ownership and to my core client base was getting the attention that they deserve, that they paid for, things like that, and knowing the difference between a neat project for a time and the trajectory of my life, my family's life, and what's going to set us up where we need to be by the time a second kid comes or in 10 years, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, second kid will probably be here before 10 years, buddy.
Exactly.
So you mentioned, we've talked a little bit about Madeline. You guys met at college, but your journey together was not typical. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. One important piece of context, and this is kind of funny. I would say the window in which I met Madeline was one of the most pivotal for me and my relationship with mentors, my relationship with authority. About 2 weeks before I met Madeline, I ended a 6-month relationship that was not my greatest idea. Parents weren't supportive, permissive, not supportive. And I think just behind the scenes, they were praying that things wouldn't work out, and they were praying hard. I was definitely in a spot mentally of, I will take advice if I agree with it versus I will take advice because your voice has weight to me. And that was probably the pinnacle of that kind of thinking for me. So I hadn't met Madeline yet, but I just had, call it a fear of God encounter with God of just like, wow, I followed my own ideas. I followed my best thought up strategies or whatever. And I hate where it left me. I hate where it got me. I feel like I'm sitting in front of a tsunami that I have no way of swimming out of the way, and it's just going to crash. And so for me, that step number one, which is a longer conversation for another time, was just repenting personally and being like, you know what? I think I have this backwards. I've been going against what my faith would tell me to do. I've been going against what my mentors, my family has been suggesting. And now I realize I am on that island. So it was funny. I had that real intense, humbling encounter. And then 2 weeks later, Madeline came, which is funny because she started college a semester late, and I'm very thankful for that. We met. I wouldn't call myself an overly smitten person. She was the exception. But about 6 months later, getting to know each other through that first semester, I went and asked her dad, like, hey, I've loved getting to know Madeline. She's amazing, highest character person I know, so much fun, yada, yada. I know that you and I probably need to get to know each other a little bit more, but I wanted to ask your permission to date. And he said, Dan, you're a really nice young man. I'm excited to get to know you. We don't date in this house. And I started doing some mental math. She has 4 other sisters. There's 7 kids in total, 4 other sisters, 3 of whom are married. And I was like, I don't get how this formula.
You do something. It might not be dating, but you're doing something.
And come to find out, I think the oldest 3, one of them kind of followed the advice. The other 2, just it's a longer story, different circumstances, didn't follow the recommended family pattern. But his whole thing was, your modern dating world, you start getting people who talk a really good game when it comes to commitment and then just flake when it comes to like when the rubber hits the road, when the going gets tough, right? And this is hard, but we see the number of couples our age, our friends that have gotten divorced within 5 years of being married is massive, absolutely massive. And so for him, the phrase he told me is, I want to see staying power. I don't want to see how good of a convincer you are. I don't want to see how eloquent or thoughtful, I want to see you stick around. And I was just at this place of, I will take whatever bowling bumpers God wants to give me. My ideas are terrible. Doesn't matter whether I agree. And so he told Madeline that he told me no, which she just started like, she blood boiled a little bit, but she's like, I'm going to have to go call Dan and tell him like we can't date. And so I called her and said, look, there's 2 ways it's going to go. we obey your dad, we don't date, and we be best friends and we figure it out as we go. Or you want to date and you want to go behind your dad's back and I'm out because that'll be me someday. And so for her, that was like the biggest sigh of relief of I don't have to explain to him what was happening. It was he was eating humble pie 6 months ago and is now totally fine with the restrictions. We just from a faith perspective, we said there's no Bible verse that says Dan and Madeline get married. There's quite a few about honoring your parents, honoring, they didn't have gray hair at the time, but the gray hair is a sign of wisdom for a reason. And so for the entire college experience, we actually never formally dated. It looked a lot like dating, but not the way you would say, even just things like the physical affection was really different than what normal dating would look like. But down the road, we got to the point where like, all right, look, it's junior year. We've spent a lot of time together. I asked him again. He said no again. So Madeline kind of cornered him one day and said, why can't Dan and I date? And he said, he's asking the wrong question. And then I was like, wait a minute, I think I need to take a step back. I don't know if I'm ready to say, can we get married? I don't know what my job's going to be, like all this kind of stuff. But it was funny. So our informal hashtag at our wedding was just friends, just married. But it was this element of we had restrictions imposed on us by mentors. And mentors is a loose word, it's parental authority, but mentors. And we made the decision to respect and honor it. And whether or not you agree with that is like the dating philosophy, in hindsight, it was perfect for what we needed because I had a tendency to go too fast. And she hadn't really been there and didn't know how her personality, her person would react in a situation like that. And the guardrails in hindsight, whether or not you agree with them philosophically, were perfect for us, but staying under that umbrella of a mentorship, under that umbrella of parental guidance was just a game changer for us.
Yeah. There's a track record there throughout the Old Testament and New Testament of staying under the hand of God's blessing. And you're obeying the folks that are in positions of authority, obeying the parents or other the folks who are speaking into your life, and allowing yourself to be guided by that, and make decisions accordingly. And frankly, there's a lot of folks, I think our society tells people that anybody over the age of 25 is an idiot. And so, under is where it should be. Our media saturated society doesn't quite think that way or function that way, right?
And I'll tell you what, as a side note, you guys probably have your own list of stories that resemble this. I regret the relationship I was in before, but I'll tell you what, it cured me of a growing rebellious streak. Not to become like complacent, but this whole element of I'm not as a big deal as I thought I was. And so when you talk about back to this theme of like second generation continuity, I started to realize that what had been put in me were seeds, but you can't bring rain, right? You can't bring the life experience that causes these things to grow up. But I'll tell you what, life rains and you will start to see what seeds were planted. If you were intentional, you'll know what's going to come up. Right. If you were planting seeds unintentionally in your kids and life experience brings that rain and you start to see fruit grow up that's not good, right, you can probably retrace your steps a little bit and be like, I see where that came from. And so I'm really, really thankful. The life events, they're going to come, they're going to happen. But for me, when the rubber hit the road, I started to see the lessons that were instilled in me, sometimes for me unwillingly, start to sprout up when life became very real.
There's a guy named Sebastian Engs who's a social media influencer, and he talks about this. He's like, I want my kids to be screwed up differently than me. Right? So if I have no illusions, I'm going to screw them up somehow, but I want to have slain my demons and not replicated my demons in my children. So that's So meanwhile, if there's intentionality on both sides, in this case, parents and son, or parents and future son-in-law, and there's a heart to be hurt, to listen, and to be shaped, to use the bumpers, and then a worthy, honoring heart to serve and do the right thing for Madeline and the right thing for you. And it's some people would say, oh, well, mom and dad kept you under a bubble, or they kept you under their heel, or too much control, or things like that. I don't think 5.5 years in, a little guy, 4 businesses started or moved between states. I don't think any of that. Yeah, I don't think it's deterring or detracting from your ability to blossom and grow and fly. So,
And I will make a note too, because I mean, it's easier to say when you have started your businesses, you've bought your house, you've had your kid, like that. It's easier to say right now. But I know you guys have the sons especially that who are in this very intense becoming stage, and it's kind of like when the old vision and the new vision come together. It's like when rivers come together. There's some choppy water until it smooths out and gets its new direction. I think there's an element of now as the previous college kid, now as the previous, call it newlywed, there's a lot less panic in moments of tension. Wayne, you were just sharing the other day, there's that perspective of, look, if I want to be in relationship with you 30 years from now, what should I do in this moment when things are intense, right? And so I think there's that element of when you're a parent, there's a strong urge to nudge, correct, guide, and it comes out differently for different people. But I think when I look back, there's a lot of moments that my parents could have per se put their foot down on battles they didn't need, the hills they didn't need to die on, right? And it would have changed my perspective of them at that time. It's not to say like one moment can ruin everything, but it's just very different. When I look now and things are choppy, whether it's miscommunications within marriage or our role at our church or businesses or even just multi-generational family relationships and communicating clearly and all that, it's a lot less panic when you're like, oh, we're in the chop. Like we got to give it time. We got to find our new shared vision. And I think for parents to give their kids the freedom, and like we're having these conversations now to say they're not putting a heavy expectation on us of what we need to be right now, aside from character. Character you can control. Trajectory, career, finances, you figure those things out. Right. And so I would just say that as one specific thing to anyone who's in that season. Your kids are in that, call it as low as 14, and then depends when they grow out of it, we'll see. But you're in the chop, not to panic, prioritize the relationship, prioritize being someone worthy of respect that earns that credibility. Yeah. And that's what carves out a new shared vision and smooths things out. When you're pulling in opposite directions, there's not peace. Everyone's always trying to make a point. Making a shared vision that combines who you are and who they are and gives them freedom to find that out for themselves. Very different relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, we're still as human beings going to have our own flaws. The image I have in my head is when Homer Simpson grabs Bart around the throat and his eyes are bugging out of his head because, dad's mad at the kid. But even in my walk, when Bryce was in middle school, he and I had some conflict as the rivers were starting to come together, and it was really driven. A lot of our conflict was driven by my own issues, where I was coming home as I was building a business. I was someone who was earning respect. I was someone who was being respected, and people of influence were listening to me. And then I'd come home, and my 12-year-old son would treat me like the gum on the bottom of his shoe, and it's like. And
different rules.
And then I would be inflamed because I wasn't getting respected, and because I'm respected outside the house, I deserve to be honored inside the house. But that's a me issue. It's not a him issue, right? Mm-hmm. So it's my response is a me issue. He still has, I still have to instill in him and be intentional in him to help him develop an honest respect for me. As his dad and that kind of thing, but the bottom line is there's a mutual investment that's got to go on there for both dad and son. So,
and sure. I think just some of the things you've shared, I think both of you guys have done resemblances of this. It's one thing to try and instill a trajectory on your kids in terms of career or just other specifics that aren't just character. It's another thing though to identify what they're passionate about and create structure around that growth and incentivize that growth. You've talked about like paying for reading, or even just things like right now, Bryce is thriving in a business management perspective he would have never gotten without the access to like the franchise businesses, things like that. And so to a large extent, those aren't things that happened in a vacuum. Those were dad and mom instilled this structure, this incentive structure. And now I get to benefit as a result of my growth. And so I think for a lot of times you talk about like you come home and it's just like my 12-year-old is yelling at me, but clients respect me, peers respect me, yada, yada. It's like totally different rules. And to say earn respect doesn't just mean being someone who you should respect. It means doing the work of engaging to earn and win the respect, especially when your kids are not eager to give it, right? It's laying aside your offenses, still parenting, still discipline, but saying, I'm going to win your respect. Not just like that you can push me around, but to be creative and put the work in.
And choosing which hills to die on is so crucial. There's so much discernment that goes into that. And, and Bryce and I have had a couple of conversations the last couple of months that are, a couple of behavioral things that I'm like, the way I was raised, mom and dad would have blown up and thrown my stuff out on the street and, there's been threats and hellfire and brimstone. But, and Bryce came to me with one of them, and he said, I've been kind of hiding this for a few months because I've been scared to what your response would be. And
that's a huge thing that he would come with that, though. Whatever it is a huge, huge testament.
Yeah, but he's like, your response isn't anything like what I expected. And I said, well, son, this is where I said, listen, as long as God gives me breath, I want to be doing life and doing business and be in relationship with you. I've got to make a decision whether I'm willing to set the next 30 years of our relationship on fire over this one thing that ultimately you're an adult and I can't control. Mm-hmm. So, I've got to make that decision about what hill to die on and how deep I'm going to dig in or get entrenched on this one issue. But you're an adult. You're going to be responsible for the impact of this down the road. Now, we should have some conversations about this. I want to have further dialogue around this. Yes, I probably in my heart have one or two hands around your neck, at least for a moment or two. But we've got to, if we're going to continue building life and businesses and having a bigger impact, financially from a perspective of character and philanthropy and other things, we can't get stuck on this. We can't let this put all the tires on our car.
Mm-hmm. So. It is remarkable. There's some version of the story, but I've heard my dad tell it more than once. Just imagine a persona here. He said the client comes to him and says, I don't understand it. Like, I paid for the best college for my son. I paid for grad school at an Ivy League. I paid to help him start a business. I paid for his car. I've helped him in so many ways. And he just he has so many problems going on. And my dad responds something along the lines of, he doesn't have any problems. Client starts getting angry, irritated. Of course he does. Look at all these problems. And he's like, no, you keep covering his problems. In terms of, for someone like Bryce, when he comes to you in that situation and says look, this is the buildup. I've been fearful of this, that, and the other. And your response is along the lines of look, you're an adult. The hardest consequence is going to be the fact that you have to carry the result of it. Suddenly, it is that internal, man, I have a responsibility that comes with my freedom. And I don't want my freedom to become something that hurts me. That discipline is more freedom than freedom without discipline, right? Yeah. And so those elements of when you want someone to step into their own vision, step into owning their own trajectory, they have to know that they eat the consequences and it's not mom and dad causing them, right?
Yeah.
That's a big difference, but that impacts your kids in a huge way.
One of the conversations May and I have had with both of our kids for a long time is that, hey, listen, you can do anything you want, but if you go out and get drunk and kill somebody, I'll sit in court with you. I'm not paying for the attorney. And I sure won't pay for an attorney to lie for you.
So, real life example of this. Did you know that I actually did not kill someone, did not get drunk, but had an event very similar to this? So, this might be, we'll see if this makes the final podcast. It's public record. It's okay. So when I was 18, I had been 18 for about less than a month, maybe 2 weeks. And I was driving to Regent to interview for the full ride scholarship. It's about 5.5 hour drive. The day before, a buddy of mine had gone to the hospital. Doctor said, you know what, he'll probably be fine. It'll be good. We'll release him home. And it was a snow day. I was like, I know I'm off school. I should go see him, but I have a big project. I'm going to go do that. Long story short, he actually ended up passing away in his yard back at home later that day. And then the sermon that night at church was, which of you didn't visit me in the hospital? Like that kind of, it was the, like all just massive discomfort, guilt. I didn't sleep a wink that night. The next day I went to school and then drove straight from school to Virginia Beach. And I don't know if you've ever done the drive through Delaware and the Virginia Peninsula. It's like no turn, straight rides through cornfields for 5 hours, right? And to make things kind of crazier, I had to do it by myself. Mom and dad were in New York at a business trip, but they only took one car. And he said, look, I know I want you to have the best, safest thing to drive since you're really tired. Don't take your 10-year-old Avalon, take my Lexus. Now, I don't know if you've ever experienced the shift from like a consumer brand car to a luxury car. When you're going 40 miles an hour, it feels like 25. I was on cruise control the whole way to Virginia Beach, except there's the big Chesapeake Bay Bridge tunnel where every toll has you come to a stop. And I turned off cruise control and I didn't turn it back on. And I got clocked going 97 in a 45 or 55. And I'll tell you what, like the speeding ticket wouldn't have been the worst part. It was just even the thought that like you're 5 miles out into the bay going 100 miles an hour, half asleep, middle of winter. Like that could have been the morgue instead of the police. But the thing was, when it came time, that was 3 miles an hour away from a felony. And it was, by the time they handed down, like, or by the time they told us what the sentence was going to be, or to say was going to be prior to a court date, I had gotten the full ride scholarship and I would lose the entire thing if I could, if they think the sentence was supposed to be like prison for 3 months. And I would lose the entire 4-year scholarship if I didn't start that fall. And so all these things, it was one of those, there was so much at stake, wouldn't have met Madeline, all this kind of other stuff. And I had to pay for the court fees. I had to pay for the lawyer. I had to pay for all of this stuff as an 18-year-old. But I also knew that if I didn't, that changed the trajectory of my life. Yeah. And it was funny because I knew my parents were with me all the way, but all the way in that moment, Dad's words were, I weren't driving. And again, way more heavy than this makes it sound, but it was like, I'll come visit. It's a long drive, but I'll come visit. So things like that, it was just, there was such a precedent of you're your own man.
Yeah.
If you need to pull over and get a hotel, you clearly had money to pay for the lawyer's fees. You could have gotten a hotel. So stuff like that. There's an emphasis on life will give you feedback on who you need to become in order to be successful and to avoid consequence. Absolutely. And I'll tell you what, so that was what happened directly before the interviews, and packing with zero sleep. I forgot dress shoes. So I was walking around in a suit and Nikes that weekend to interview for a scholarship. I'll say clearly the Lord had some plans and he wanted me to be there, but it was just the element of like, it was very real very quickly that the consequences were going to be on me, and having been given growing shoulders to say, okay, like if it comes to something terrible, like if I had to go to prison for 3 months, that would have been what it was, and I'd have to figure it out from there. Right. So just that, like the relationship is solid, but be the person that can handle what life is going to put on your plate.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, that lesson, that mindset of training your kids. And, I always say we're raising adults. We're not raising children.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's not, I don't want to have a 23-year-old child coming to dinner. So I whether you live in my house is irrelevant. It's secondary. It's separate. It's a separate issue.
Mm-hmm.
Are you mentally, are you just from a decision perspective, can you make your own decisions? Can you stand on your own 2 feet? And I think that too frequently wealth can, when it's not passed well, and it's not passed with values, then the wealth can spoil and can stop somebody from becoming someone who can make those decisions on their own, right?
Mm-hmm.
That ultimately is the measure of the people we will become, is our ability to make decisions, live with the consequences. And we either, and it's the old saying, we either win or we learn. Right? Failure is an option, but failure is not a destination. It's not an end.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
it's also worth noting, I think you guys understand this. I am aware of what my parents have built financially. I also don't ever really think about it. And that's not to say, like, well, it's just normalized, but it's the element of that's not part of my financial plan, right? It's I want to, by the time, Lord willing, someday far in the future, that becomes a discussion of a handoff, a transfer.
Right.
I want to be ready to welcome those resources to something that was functioning really well without it. Something that isn't desperate or, what's the word? Not spontaneous isn't the word, but compulsive, impulsive. And just that element of like, you have to understand that the measure of your success is your success without the family, like empire, so to speak. Yeah. And for you, if I hand that to someone that doesn't need it, that would be my measure of success.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the challenges is that you, especially today where life expectancy is into the 80s and regularly see people in their 90s. I mean, for crying out loud, if you never become financially responsible on your own, if you never become a person of character who can handle themselves, who can make good decisions on your own, and you're waiting for that eventual inheritance, I mean, you could be 75 before that money shows up. Mm-hmm. And you've lost your entire life. You've not stewarded 3/4 of a century. Mm-hmm. Well, and what, and if I'm the parent in that situation, if you've not figured out how to steward your own life well by that point, I mean, that's why 70% of money doesn't make it to the second generation, and over 90% doesn't make it to the third.
It's true. Right?
One of the smartest things I ever did was get out of a situation. I met with a couple, husband and wife. She was a corporate attorney. He was an ophthalmologist. Between them, they made almost $800,000 a year. They're spending over $1 million a year. And
that's a bad equation.
Yeah. The only reason they were able to keep up that lifestyle was because both of their parents and both of their grandparents had trusts totaling like $25 million that they were the beneficiaries of. And so they were interviewing me as a financial advisor who was in my 20s at the time. I was probably 28, 29 when I interviewed with them. And they were looking for somebody. I think they were really, looking for somebody dumb enough to take the job. But I was
wrong guess.
Well, yeah, I listened to him for about an hour, and I said, "Listen, I think this is what I hear. What I hear you saying is that you all live a massive, unopulently wasteful lifestyle, and the only reason you're able to do that is because the frugality and wisdom and investing of 2 generations on both sides of your family tree." But other than paying for an Ivy League college education, because in your words, damn it, my kids are going to go to an Ivy League school. You don't care if there's 3 nickels left on the back end of this, just so long as you can live this lifestyle until the day you die. And the last check doesn't bounce. You don't care about institutions, organizations, philanthropy, your children or family down the you're willing to smoke 2 generations of frugality and wisdom in this generation. And he's like, well, that's a little harsh, but yeah, that's what I'm looking for. I was like, man, I got to run. I couldn't get out of there fast enough because, and I told him, I said, listen, your wife's an attorney. At some point, whoever takes this job is not going to meet your expectations, and they're going to end up in court sued by your wife. And
28-year-old Wayne does not need that.
What's that?
Said 28-year-old Wayne does not need that.
28-year-old Wayne does not need that. So I was only, a year or two removed from, having gone through the transition that your dad and I talked about, where, we had to pay attorneys just to get me out of, false accusations in December 2000.
The way that we describe it, we describe to people, and for me, obviously, it's secondhand, is if you ever read John Grisham's The Firm, then you kind of know how that went. That's the comparison.
We literally invoked that.
We invoked that today. Yeah, in that episode. Yep. So.
I'll tell you what, as one side note, though, and I'd love to just float this question to you guys. You guys both work with people for whom making money is not an issue. When you talk about like that first generation wealth accumulator, and we're focusing on the topic of how do you raise up a second generation that's a good steward of it. How often do you guys see, whether it's in financial planning for you, Wayne, or just Trent, within the personal coaching side of your business, people who have been successful financially, but then run into that issue of like no amount of money can fix the next generation's issues.
Yeah. Well, I think that so much of what we try to communicate with clients is it's more important what you put in your kids and what you leave to your kids, right? And that's a recurring theme because, it's and we want our clients not just become wealth accumulators, but wealth accelerators. We want to use the tools in the tax code and to not just pass money at death, but to accelerate money during their lifetime, and leave their kids, completely able to be more philanthropic and think bigger and dream more and envision more than mom and dad could. That's a part of our mission, but it's hard to it's hard for folks to make that transition. I use the analogy to say, for too many wealthy families, mom and dad have figured out, they went to the slot machine of life and started pulling the handle, and they figured out how to pull the handle, and money came out. And they got really good at pulling the handle, but you got to be there to pull the handle, and you got to keep pulling the handle and pulling the handle and pulling the handle and pulling the handle. And so mom and dad got so busy pulling the handle at the job that they were good at that they forgot to do a few things. First of all, they forgot to teach their kids how to pull a handle, and so they're leaving their kid to go out into the world and find their own slot machine and find their own handle to pull. And there's not a lot of intentionality. And hey, I'll pay for the school, or I'll pay for any college or things like that. But there's not a lot of intentionality of how to think about, well, what slot machines are out there, what jobs are out there, and how should we be thinking about that? And we had a whole generation of kids that we raised and said, oh, just follow your passions, whatever the devil that means. And the flip side is, if mom and dad can be a little more patient, maybe be willing to accumulate a little less, but hey, maybe we can figure out how to build one of these slot machines. Instead of just pulling the lever on somebody else's slot machine that ultimately is making the owner of that business rich, maybe we start doing some studying and figuring out how to build our own slot machine. And then if we do that right, and we go from, go back to Robert Kiyosaki and his cash flow quadrant, go from being an employee to self-employed to building a business, maybe we can help our kids, actually help us operate. We can actually transition the slot machine to them and not just teach them how to do the slot machine, but how to build slot machines. The slot machine in that situation is just a euphemism for different businesses.
It's a vehicle.
Yeah, it's just a vehicle, right? So.
If I can pass one quick question to Trent, because I think you and I actually touched on this a little bit when we were all out in Tahoe. But I think sometimes it's hard when you find yourself like listening to a conversation like this and you say like, man, I wish I had started sooner, because you feel like you're a little bit downstream. Can you just maybe share some thoughts on if someone finds themselves like, hey, I feel like I'm at a spot where I'm starting to realize my kids have drifted a different direction. I feel like I don't have their respect as they're kind of launching. What are some ideas that, just in terms of from a parent's perspective, of like, hey, how do you get started turning the tide a little bit?
It's interesting. A lot of this comes down to communication. Are we communicating well? And I think that parents aren't asking enough questions. Parents aren't curious. They're not starting from a place of curiosity to find out what's going on. And so what happens is we tend to assume. And if I start running down the road of my assumptions, I may or may not be correct with this, but the challenge is not only does this child not feel heard, they certainly don't feel celebrated in that moment. The point being that if we just ask better questions, I think we're going to get a better sense of response. And when we ask questions, even if they got what you were sharing with them, now you know that they got it. So it's not enough that you taught it. Did they got it, if you will, right? So like, if we ask questions, we can hear back in real time what they're actually getting or not getting. So it almost doesn't matter, like as a parent, did you teach them well? Well, let's judge how well you taught them based on what they actually gleaned, what they actually captured and assimilated, not based on whether you threw a good spiral. If it was uncatchable, it doesn't matter, right? So at some point, let's judge our ability to throw a spiral based on their ability to catch it. Let's throw this thing different. Maybe it doesn't need to be zipped in. Maybe it needs to be a little softer. So I'm just using an analogy here to get the idea of asking more questions of our kids and getting curious as opposed to just assuming what's really going on there. And even just asking questions, we were talking about strengths earlier, like, hey, what are you excited about? Or when they're failing, hey, let's learn how to fail well. Hey, we missed this one here. So you talk about learning the lessons, Wayne. Hey, what do you wish you'd done differently? Even asking a kid that question. And a lot of this comes, Dan, because when I transitioned from being what I would call a mentor, I was coaching is what people called it, but I was mentoring people in the same company I grew up in. Well, I can only mentor people that I have experience in that world if I'm further up the path that they're actually on. And the beautiful thing with coaching is it actually doesn't require expertise in that world. I just need to ask great questions.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the more I can learn the jargon or the language, if you will, yes, the better questions that I'll ask. But I asked my mentor, I asked my trainer, and Christian Simpson. I said, "How do I transition all these people? Some of them worked for 7 years, from mentoring to coaching." And he laughed. He goes, "Just start asking better questions." I said, "No transition needed. Don't need to tell him what I'm doing." He's like, "Just start asking great questions." And lo and behold, 100% correct. So I perhaps am oversimplifying here, just for the sake
No,
of time. But when it comes to parents, if they just asked better questions, and they're like, "Well, can you give me some?" I'm like, "That's not how this works. It's not a can set
you
of
need to build that
questions."
muscle.
There you
And
go. Like,
if
get
I can
curious.
if I can add to this too, just from the kids' perspective,
Yeah.
if you find yourself in conflict a lot, it's usually because you're telling more than asking. It is way easier on your kids to let them be the critic than to make them construct their own answer. Because I think there's a part of it, like there's just, it's easy to criticize. It's really hard to build. Every business owner knows this. When you turn that around though, and you start asking your kids questions, a lot of my corrective learning curves have not come from being told what to do. They've been told by me having, like, saying something out loud
Mm-hmm.
and then realizing that's not a hill I want to die on, or I don't even think that's right. So like the humbling of like, I wasn't right, not you're wrong about me, but I'm not right. And so I think, one, it helps you understand your kids. You'll get tactical insight you never would have otherwise had. But your kids have to start getting like strong in not just criticizing, but constructing a cohesive vision that they can believe in and buy into, versus constantly fending off someone else's, right? And I think that's the kid perspective of the questions.
What's tricky here is that I've got a 17-year-old daughter, so I don't want to give anybody the impression here this is all rainbows and unicorns. I'm a trained coach of 17 years, and sometimes I'll ask a question and she is not interested in engaging. So like even
Mm-hmm.
I'll ask a question that I'm just whiffing and hard, right? So we're all in progress here. But that says,
Bat 300 and you'll have a good day.
you know, one extra hit, it's all I need, right? So, but I'll ask questions like, "What do you want here?" And just start asking that question, because again, to Wayne's point, my job is to raise independent kids, independent of me, independent on God, is my goal. So what do you want is an important question that we need them to start asking younger and younger. But the more she can decide what her desired outcome is, the better chance she's got of formulating some good possibilities. I said, "Hey, if we didn't have to be right, what could we do? And what do you want to do?" Now, if I look at that and then she's going to run off a cliff as a parent, yes, I will pull her back from that one, right? However, short of that, sometimes she'll pick A, and I'm like, "Boy, I don't think A is the one." I'm like, "All right, let's check in. You try A."
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes A works, and I'm like, "Huh, look at that." And
Another
then
word
she figured out her own
Keeverism
thing.
is another word Keeverism is, let me know how that goes for you. That is the, you have my permission to try. Let me know how that goes for you.
It doesn't sound like it sounds like it's a kiss of death, actually, right? Yeah, let me know how that goes.
You tremble in your boots a little bit when that's the response.
You're like, "Oh,
You know,
maybe
every
being
once in a
who I want to
while,
be."
every once in a while, we still pick up wisdom like that. We changed churches about, I don't know, 11 years ago, 12 years ago. And we were eyeball deep in the Christian, in running a Christian school at the time, and trying to run visionary wealth management, and probably doing both badly in reality and in retrospect. And like the second time I met our senior pastor, a guy named Warren Betcher, Warren says to me, "Wayne, you were too involved in this school. The school is too dependent on your generosity. The organization and institution is too dependent on you and your wife showing up. This is not going to end well. It's going to be painful, and it's going to be one of the most painful experiences of your life. But it's not going to happen today. And I'm not going to tell you that I can fix it. I think this is a journey you have to go on your own. What I want you to hear is that when that day comes, I'm here for you." And I'll be here to talk you through it and support you through it and to encourage you through it. And I came away, I'm like, yeah, I mean, it's easy to come away even as an adult male and say, what do you mean I'm going to fail at this? And, I'm going to muscle through. I'm going to prove you wrong. I mean,
I'll show him.
And there's all of the still youthful exuberance and hubris going on in that, even as I would have been a 39 or 40-year-old guy at that stage. But we were struggling, we were drowning, and he was spot on. But he didn't tell me, hey, you got to go out and get out of this thing right now. He just gave me wisdom and said, hey, look, I don't think there's a reasonable way for this to end well, I'm going to be right here for you when you need me.
Mm-hmm.
It was one of those. It was one of the things, the conversations that really endeared us to the church and to Warren and his wife Kim, because sure enough, when that thing was crashing, we were meeting with Warren and Kim with our head in our hands, just going, "Oh my gosh, this is so painful. This hurts so bad," and that's it. But we had a support system there of people who had seen things like this. Warren and Kim are about are 10 or 15 years older than we are, so they've seen more the further down the road and the journey. And it's just having people in our lives, having mentors in our lives when we hit those milestone moments. So,
and for what it's worth, bringing this back to the parental second generation thing, Trent, you made the comment of like plan A. If plan A works, you're like, oh, well, darn, look at that. I think even in something like that was one of the heaviest times of your guys' lives as a family. And if the school had worked out by some other alternate path, you wouldn't necessarily go back to them and be like, look, I'm succeeding, like almost to spite, like you guys didn't believe in us. It's one of those where like, look, I didn't think that would work out. I'm so happy that it did. It leaves them in a posture of being close and supportive and able to celebrate with you. Yeah. And so I think that's the opposite of tension, where like, if you pass on a vision or pass on a criticism, that's like a death sentence. Sometimes your kids become even more motivated to run that direction, almost as like their motivation is to prove you wrong, not to become successful, right? That's a really sweet example of that.
Yeah, well, that's a conversation that's actually a specific conversation we've had about our kids, spouses our kids will marry. They say, listen, it's young, because young love, every love story has an antagonist in it. Right? There's a parent who doesn't want them to be together, or there's a friend at school who's trying to break them up, something they've got to overcome together to become the forged in the fire, born in the foxhole together, lifelong love of Romeo and Juliet, who both ended up dead. But it
was lifelong.
That's right. It was. So, but we what we don't want to do is we don't want to be the parent who says, who starts picking on, oh, well, we don't like this about your boyfriend or girlfriend, or the death sentence is that this person is not good enough for you, right? Because the fact of the matter is, May and I got married before either one of us was finished college. My idea was to finish college and then go back to landscaping. Like that was my lifelong dream, was just to run my landscaping business, making $40,000 or $50,000 a year, which was really good money in the mid '90s. But at the end of the day, it was, that I didn't have grand dreams and aspirations. And I spent 3.5 hours asking for my wife's hand in marriage and arguing the finer points of Wesleyan versus Baptist doctrine at the time. And my father-in-law said, his resounding approval was, well, you two kids are going to do what you want anyway. There's nothing I can say that's going to change your minds. But which didn't sound like a resounding approval at the time, but it kind of betrayed that, hey, I have no idea if this is going to work out, but I'm not going to be the one that gets in the way between you, because ultimately that makes me the enemy. And so the decision we've taken with and communicated to both of our kids is that, hey, you fall in love with who you fall in love with. It's our job to pour into them, right? It's our job to help build them to be your, and if they're going to outgrow you in some areas, and it's our job to encourage you to grow alongside of them in those areas. And you're going to be further down your journey in some areas, and it's our job to help encourage them and help feed them and get them to catch up with you. But ultimately, it's our job to be your cheerleaders and motivators and resource part of your resource team to help you both grow together. But we're not going to choose the other person in that marriage. And we're not going to sit here and have some kind of an opinion where we become the antagonist of your story that you have to overcome in order for true love to win out, because all that's going to lead us on separate paths and leave you all with hard feelings, for decades down the road. So we're just not going to do that. So.
Now, helping your kids understand themselves in those scenarios is a hard skill, I'd imagine. I haven't had that with a 1-year-old yet. But even just, I think for my parents, there's a legendary family story of my dad asking to date my mom. And my mom, who had a deep respect for her dad, said, the rule is you got to ask him. So he drove down to the college town, took him out to Burger King, had his famous 3 questions. And the third one was, tell me exactly in your book, how far is okay physically while dating? My dad thought he was doing great after the first 2 questions. And in his word, like the hamburger turned sideways in his throat, like the cartoons, like when there was that kind of question. But I'll tell you what, the relationship, exactly like you said, Wayne, was not to defeat someone else's opinion against you, but it was to win over someone who mattered, right? And so to a large extent, where we are now in our marriage, I am fully comfortable if Madeline had a question that she's like, I'd really love to talk to your parents about this. Or like, it's a frequent thing, especially when we're wrestling through some of the stress of business. It's a frequent thing for her to say, I think you and I need to put a pin in this until you talk to your dad. And just that respect of, we are both out of our depth, but we know someone that we both trust to referee. That's a healthy relationship that it has to be able to take some shots along the way, mistakes, miscommunications, all that stuff. But that's the picture of what you can end up with. And so I don't have the parent's perspective of what my dad sees when he looks down as far as talk about second generation and wealth acceleration. We'll hear that podcast another time. But just to that extent of, the here and now is healthy. And that feels like if we can keep that is the best measure of the next 30 years.
Mm-hmm. No, that's good. That's really good. So, Trent, I'll give you one swing at some final thoughts here before I ask Dan our final question. So
if you were to shout out, I love that you're the second of the Keevers we've spoken to today. And both Keevers, their top 5 like mentors are all family. Immediate family on both sides, by the way. You and your dad, you guys didn't collaborate ahead of time, I'm assuming, although that would be a fun prank too. And it wouldn't be the first one we've heard about today from Ward Keever. So if I was to give you a chance to shout out some of your non-DNA, non-family mentors, who emerges for you?
It's a great question. One thing I will say, and this is not just for the sake of the show, is Wayne is one of the people that I would count. And it's funny because you knew me since I was a little kid. Wayne was the cornerstone client for Evergreen. When we made the decision to siphon down and focus in, one of the key questions we asked is, who do we trust the most to help us grow? Not just like as they're our ideal client, but someone that we think has a strong relational bond and wants to invest in me. Because I was very aware, cutting off 80% of our clients, that I needed someone that had a vested interest in me. And I think that's one of the best things that I could say, like pointing to the level of trust and like, I believe this person wants to pour into me. And it's interesting because in addition to being like client vendor, Wayne is one of the people who has gone out of his way the most to ask about how things are going, if there's ways that Visionary can help, if there's ways that you can spearhead. And it's funny because like to this day, one of the biggest jokes is that my dad is not a client of Evergreen. We've done some work for them, but he is someone who loves to in-house everything. And so that's one of the biggest jokes. He's talking about like in every way that dad has poured in, he's never really been a steady client of Evergreen. So in my business life, Visionary, and specifically Wayne, has been someone that I always know, one, takes an interest and will give the time. In terms of everyone's short on time, Wayne will give the time. But he is available to say like, hey, if you need help crossing a bridge, let me know. There was like even well before we brought Melissa onto the team, he reached out and said, hey, if you're ever at a spot where like, hey, I just need a little bit more to like bring on an employee, make this work, like let's hammer out a new scope, add some stuff to it. You just let me know. And it's funny because when you're an entrepreneur, you're used to having to earn your keep everywhere you go. And that's still true. But to the extent that you have someone that you know is interested in your 30-year growth as a client is extremely rare. So that's the first one that comes to mind. Thank you for that very much, Wayne. Another one in my faith, on that side of my life, the closest people are definitely family. That being said, there is a pastor or a campus pastor that I had in college. It's one of the first that comes to mind. And he lived out the passage. We saw fit not to just share with you the gospel, but our lives as well. And he was 28, 3 kids, making almost below minimum wage as a campus pastor. There's like a 1,500 student campus body, and they had 2 full-time staff. It was crazy for campus ministries.
Wow.
And just the way that he poured out, he was not a teacher that I resonated with, but I could hang in his office and just listen to him talk about his walk and how he was growing for hours. And he went out of his way to make that available. And just so for me, with the friends that we have now, it really modeled for me that friendship is not done in teaching. It's done in walking together. It's done in, a lot of times, asking questions more than it would ever be prescriptive. Mm-hmm. And so his name was Jason. Jason, for 3 years before he moved on to be a pastor, really modeled side-by-side mentorship when he was the older, more advanced person as well.
I appreciate you sharing that. And it's just wonderful to hear, about other mentors. It kind of brings mentors that I've had to mind. And one of my good friends is Wayne as well. It's part of the reason I'd love to just tag onto his podcast, even if I sit silently for 45 minutes at a time, just observing you guys. It was amazing. But one of the things I do celebrate about Wayne is that his superpower seems to be to identify talent and sponsor that talent. Mm-hmm. And what was amazing today was to see your dad's hand in that as one of his first sponsors, to really help him see life differently. And then for him to bring that full circle to you, not because you're his kid, but because he sees talent in you as well, and that you're a man of value and something that he wants to just tie into. And in fact, I'm wondering how many listeners here are clients of Wayne's, and just like, this is just how he shows up. What I love is that Wayne doesn't have to put that tie on or that hat on. This is who he is. It's like, he just is Superman underneath, and this is how he shows up for people, is he believes, and then he's all in, and you feel that lift. So I'm going to pump your tires a little bit here, Wayne. It's one of the reasons I'm here.
The checks are in the mail, guys.
I'll tell you what, just Trent, to that comment, the mentorship aspect that I feel with you, Wayne, there's definitely the encouragement of knowing there's like, hey, if there's moments in life you need support, like, keep me on the list. I'd love to see how we can figure things out alongside you. But I think one of the bigger things is that because I see you as a mentor, your words carry more weight. And whether it was the decision to commit in Evergreen in the direction of financial planners, or just other steps along the way, Trent said, like, you're a talent identifier. And when you're someone who's sitting underneath that and saying, like, hey, Wayne has been willing to invest in us, and it's not a charity case. That's one of those things that for me, you turn around and you're like, shoot, we might be onto something. I don't always believe that day in and day out. Like, I believe in our trajectory, but some days you just wrestle with that. But then you have people like that who you respect, who are successful. They figured it out in many ways, who say, hey, I want you to be around my sphere for the next 30 years. How can we make that happen? That's a very big foundation to stand on.
Yeah, that's we started another business this year, Visionary Equipment Leasing, and there's a young guy who's running named Zed Latourette, who's running a trucking business down in South Carolina and Georgia, and he's leasing all the equipment we bought through that business this year. He's leasing every piece of equipment in that business right now, and but part of the conversation that we've had is that he had an amazing business plan. He's a hardworking guy. I know his work ethic, his character. But May and I were talking about, well, what are we getting? What are we getting out of this other than another business and to operate and that kind of thing? And I'm like, listen, if this kid's successful, he's going to be an avatar client for Visionary Wealth Management within 24 months, if not sooner. And so, like, he's going to need a financial planner, and there's not very many opportunities for financial planners to actually help manufacture their next avatar client. So when that opportunity showed up, it was I'm looking forward to seeing what happens with Zed and his wife Mallory over the next year or two. But,
and I don't know him, but I tell you what, having someone willing to put that kind of capital in is a vote of confidence that matters a lot. He might have a great business plan, but you need a grounding of conviction when things are choppy.
Yeah.
And just having someone who doesn't just per se speak the words of encouragement, but backs you because of self-interest in a healthy way, it's a huge vote of confidence.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a profitable relationship for us out of the gate anyway. So,
Oh yeah.
so Dan, we're going to finish this up, but looking back on your journey, what's one area you would want to leave us with that in the area or the topic of envisioning more?
It's a really good question. When it comes to envisioning more, I think the pivotal window in the second generation, and so this is obviously a much larger conversation than for people in their 20s, but I'll speak to my own experience. If you want the second generation to envision more for the broader family, call it the family name or whatever legacy you want to capture it with, you have to be willing to share and pass ownership of that vision. And if you are trying to steer the family from the top down, you'll end up with a lot of passengers and no one else who knows how to drive. And so I think having that window as people my age are trying to figure out who they're going to be in 10 years, 20 years, all that kind of stuff, and that keeps shifting, giving your kids areas, not just within their own lives, that's for them obviously, but within the family where there's some steering and there's some leadership, there's some decision making, is how you train them to be good decision makers in 20 years. I think specifically, one of the things my dad shared with me recently is you talk about like, okay, how is the second generation starting ahead? It's hard for me to look at his life and feel like I have a head start. He's been so successful, so accomplished, but he reminded me, he's like, look, you have like a 5 to 7 year head start on being an entrepreneur in terms of building this thing when you don't have 2 kids and it's Y2K, right? He said, I was also close to 40 when I started to actually start thinking about how do I build this bigger than me, add other advisors, things like that. He's like, you are working on adding employees in your 20s. He's like, so you look at me in my 50s and say, man, I just so far away from that. He's like, well, yeah, you should be. If you were within spitting distance of me as a 20-year-old, I'm not successful. But so just to that picture where you're saying like, okay, how do I accelerate the ownership that the next generation has? That is how you get your family on a pathway to envisioning more. The next generation is not hopefully they maintain it. It's hopefully they take ownership and they drive this thing the way we started. It will probably look different than you would picture it particularly, but having that time of overlap is such a good place to imprint the best parts of you and let them continue to clean it up and drive it forward.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's so good. And the reality is success comes very slowly and then all at once.
Yeah.
And so, the learning the lessons, grinding in your 20s and 30s to build something bigger than you, building something of significance, that process takes an awful long time. And ultimately, second generation, third generation, we can help accelerate the process, accelerate the thinking. Like you said, learning from the lessons of other people instead of having to get drugged down every mile of gravel on your butt to learn every lesson, right? So learning from the lessons of others is so crucial. So we can accelerate you as first generation into second generation and third generation, but we really can't help you skip the lessons in some way. You've got to skip the lesson. That's the conversation we're having in our family right now, which is, in some sense, our kids will never get punched in the face as hard as May and I did. They'll never experience quite the despondency, the really low valleys that May and I did. And in some sense, May and I forged our souls together in those valleys. We learned to lean on each other because there was no other option, right? We had groups of young married couples who would go out after church every Sunday night for pizza. And for 2.5 years, we couldn't go with them because we couldn't afford pizza. And I tell that story today. There's people in the room who are going out for pizza are like, well, we would have floated you money for the pizza. And it's like, no, saying no to going out actually was part of our souls being forged together. It was part of our journey. It was part of our what was necessary for us to become who we are today. And so it was good for us not to be eating pizza, not just for our health. So, that's Dan, I'm so grateful for this time together today. Trent, thank you again for your generosity and sitting on 2 sessions today. At Visionary Wealth and the Envision More podcast, we want to be helping clients and executives and first generation wealth building families envision more impact for their family multi-generationally. That's what this is all about. Today has been a fantastic conversation with a young entrepreneur, Dan Keever, who's a second generation accelerator at this stage. Thank you so much, guys, for being here today.
Thanks for the invite, Wayne.
Thanks for having us, Wayne. Thank you for listening to the Envision More podcast with Wayne Wagner Jr. of Visionary Wealth Management. We hope you were encouraged and inspired by the conversation today. If you want to dig deeper into the show notes or Wayne's work at Visionary, you can find us at envisionmore.com. That's Envision with a Z. Advisory services are provided through Wealth Plan Investment Management. Wealth Plan Investment Management and Visionary Wealth Management are separate entities. The content is developed from sources believed to be providing accurate information. The information in this material is not intended as tax or legal advice. Please consult legal or tax professionals for specific information regarding your individual situation. The opinions and material provided are for general information and should not be considered a solicitation for the purchase or sale of any security. Thanks for listening.